So we continue on with our slide presentation concerning Halloween. Now, there are several things that we know about the priestly class of the Celtic people who were the Druids. As we mentioned in our previous lesson, the literal interpretation of the word Druid is men of the oak. But who were the Druids? There are three very wicked activities that we know the Druids did as a part of their priestly services towards their people, all of which tie into the Halloween holiday season. The first was the communication with the dead. The second was they practiced divination and witchcraft. The third, they made sacrifices to their gods to appease them. So let's take a look at communication with the dead and the practice of witchcraft. This is what Samhain was about. Samhain was about the dead. As we had mentioned in our last lesson, the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest during this season of Samhain. So it was believed during this time that the spirits of departed family members, uncles, brothers, sisters, mothers, or fathers, could visit their living relatives and walk among the living, and that the living could interact with these said spirits. But it was also believed that malevolent or wicked spirits could also pass between the veil to the living as well and haunt the living. And even more than this, the Druids could actually command these evil, malevolent spirits through witchcraft.
What does witchcraft have to do with Halloween? Halloween is just trick or treat, children having fun, costume parties, Christians and non-Christians alike celebrating. The Christians can say, we don't think anything about the bad things from Halloween. But let's start out for basics. What is Halloween?
Well, Halloween is a celebration of the dead. And it started out with Celtic Druids years and years and years and years ago. This whole entire holiday or day was created to summons up the god of the dead. And they would basically call on the people who had passed on, who were in the graves, for their spirits to come and roam through the earth on this day, that they believed that there was a veil that was thin crossing over from summer into the next month. They believe that that veil was thin going into the next season. And so because the veil was thin between the spirit world and the earth world, that the two could collide. And so that's what they wanted. It was all steeped in witchcraft. It was all steeped in communicating with the dead. That's the original root and origin of this holiday. So much so that they believed that this happened, and they felt this happening, that they would disguise themselves in costumes so that these spirits that were roaming around the earth on this day, that they wouldn't try to take vengeance out on them as a human, that the spirits would see them dressed up as a ghost, and they would pass the human by and go to the next one. And so that's where we incorporate costumes and dressing up. That's why a lot of times when you see costumes, although you see nice angels and these things, but most of them are scary. They are horrific. They're ghouls and goblins and all the things that bring fear.
And by the way, if there's one spirit that we've seen rear its ugly head because of COVID, it's the spirit of fear. We don't need anything in addition
Come on.
to bring fear on people.
Right.
But do you think, or no, I'm just curious, do witches use Halloween as a point of contact to either recruit people or harm people?
Yes, absolutely. Now, I will tell you this. For me in my life, when I was practicing witchcraft, I wasn't around witches and warlocks who were doing what I would call like evil things. At least in my view, it wasn't too bad, like sacrifices, killing animals, even kidnapping children, all of these things. I wasn't around that group, but I did know, which most people know, that that thing does happen. This is a day that witches and Satanists look forward to, like Christians look forward to Resurrection Sunday or Christmas or celebrating Jesus. This is a holiday that people are witches, Satanists, people that are doing sorcery and magic, they are on high alert. They will rest all that whole week so that that night they can be up throughout the night practicing spells, the craft, even roaming around. You notice that if you look at statistics, that night there's more kidnappings, there's more people going missing, there's more crime, there's more murders that happen. That night is like the devil's play night. And even the person that started the Satanic Church, he's passed on now, but he said he loves that Christians allow their children to participate and worship the devil at least one night of the year.
Now, witchcraft is the performing of incantations, spells, and rituals that allow a witch, warlock, or wizard to interface and essentially cut a deal with demons or devils. But more clearly, they were cutting a deal with Satan. The Druids, who were very powerful witches, warlocks, and wizards, were very skilled in these dark arts. Yet, even more than this, they were very cruel towards their victims in so many ways. They were essentially cruel in these ways. So this discussion concerning how cruel the Druids were towards their sacrificial victims takes us back to the sacrificial rituals at Stonehenge. The sacrificial site of Stonehenge played an important role in human sacrifice during Samhain. Stonehenge was constructed of blue granite. The only source of this blue granite was approximately 70 miles from the Stonehenge site in Scotland. The legend regarding how this blue granite was transported to the Stonehenge site. Now you have to understand that these huge stones weighed anywhere from 20 to 30 tons. The legend says that Merlin, the most powerful wizard that ever lived, got the Nephilim giants to transport this blue granite to the site. Now, the giants, i.e. Nephilim, figures somewhat prominently in the story of the Druids. The Stonehenge is an archaeological site where more than 4,000 skeletal remains have been unearthed. It is not the only megalithic temple because there are hundreds scattered throughout the area. And Stonehenge is actually the smallest megalith. The largest stone temple is in Avesbury, measuring a mile in circumference. Stonehenge is also an astrological observatory. The Druids practiced astrology, but most notable, Stonehenge is where the Druids performed their human sacrifices 8 times a year. On the night of Samhain, the Druids would gather together and they would hollow out and carve turnips or gourds. Now understand, wild turnips are really large. When this tradition was transplanted to America, people would use pumpkins rather than turnips or gourds. But what the Druids would do is carve out turnips and make candles out of human fat that was procured from earlier sacrifices and place these candles inside the turnips they had carved out and fashion them into lanterns. Then they would travel throughout the countryside and knock very hard on the door of a duke or a lord or a noble and yelled, "Trick or treat." Now, these words, trick or treat, back during these ancient times, would send shivers of terror down the spine of the occupants of the manor because the treat that the Druids were looking for was a person to sacrifice. So the head of the household either gave the Druids a house servant, or if there wasn't a house servant, they would have to give the Druids a family member. If the head of the manor provided a treat, a sacrificial victim, in other words, the Druids would place the lantern made out of the turnip with the candle made out of human fat in front of the door and light it. And this lantern would protect the household from all the demonic forces that the Druids would summon up during their rituals on the night of Samhain. Remember, the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest during that night. Now, if the head of the manor refused to cooperate with the Druids and would not provide a sacrifice, then the Druids would paint a six-pointed star in blood on the door of that person's manor. The six-pointed star is known as a hexagram, and it is the evilest symbol you could possibly use. There's no other symbol in the world that could surpass this symbol. It is pure, unadulterated evil. Now understand this. It is not the Star of David. David never had a star as a symbol. When this hexagram was painted on a manor door, the demonic forces of hell was unleashed upon that household, and everyone under that roof literally died of fear that night. The Halloween tradition of bobbing for apples. Now, you would think that the tradition of bobbing for apples would be one of innocent fun, but the roots of this tradition was a very, very cruel and wicked game that the Druids had fun playing with their sacrificial victims. Sacrificial victims mainly comprised of the victims that were given over from a manor, the criminals in the Celtic tribe, and prisoners of a battle. On the night of Samhain, these victims were brought to Stonehenge, the temple site of the Druids, and then they would be made to form a single file line and to stand at a large cast iron cauldron. Then the Druid priests would throw apples into the cauldron. The cauldron was already filled up with some sort of apple cider concoction. The concoction was brought to a furious boil, and the victims were given a proposition. So now here was the proposition. If a victim was able to stick his or hers head in the cauldron and grab an apple between his or hers teeth, the victim, who was bound with cords around their wrist, would have those cords cut and the victim was set free. And of course, the temperature of this scalding hot brew that was in the cauldron was hot enough to melt the flesh off the bone. But if a victim failed in their attempt to grab the apple, they were thrown on the ground and the druids would behead that victim. And excavations at Stonehenge have turned up many skeletal remains of beheaded victims. And so we may have the origin of such hideous Halloween masks, faces as this one here. The face of someone who may have attempted to actually save their life by attempting to bob for an apple with horrible consequences, surviving third to fourth degree burns. Now, the Druid priests would send out the Celtic warriors a week in advance to gather wicker reeds, the same wicker reeds used today to make wicker furniture, wicker baskets, even Easter baskets. And I even remember the large wicker chairs with the wide back and four legs, or even the wicker baskets that were suspended from the ceiling that you could sit in. But the wicker reeds that were gathered by the Celtic warriors were used by the Druids to construct the Wicker Man. Now, we get the account of the Wicker Man from Julius Caesar. In the mid first century BC, Julius Caesar conquered the lands of the Gaul, Britain, and Ireland, which were the Celtic lands. These Celtic people shared similar languages, beliefs, and traditional practices. Julius Caesar, in his memoir account, spoke of the extreme human sacrifices the Celtic people would carry out when they were threatened with disease or a dangerous enemy. As a nation, the Gaelic or Celtic people were extremely devoted to superstitious rites. And I quote, when they were disturbed by the outbreak of severe disease or when they were engaged in dangerous wars, they will sacrifice men as victims or pledge to sacrifice them. They employed the Druids, the Celtic priests, as the performers of these sacrifices. This is because they think to gain the favor of the immortal gods, the life of a man may be offered for the life of a man. Sacrifices of this kind are ordained for national purposes. Taken from Caesar's Gaelic Wars, Book 6, Passage 16. The sacrificial victims could have been men of their own tribe or prisoners of war. But the most horrific and dramatic of sacrifices were performed employing the Wicker Man. Wicker reed was a very flexible plant that was really easy to work with, yet sturdy and strong. The Wicker Man was a giant effigy of a man constructed of scaffolding and wicker reed made into the form of a man. This giant effigy was anywhere from 20 to 40 feet tall, and we can't help but imagine that these giant effigies were reminiscent of Nephilim giants themselves. Now, there were various cages built inside this giant effigy. Animals, grains, and fruit from the harvest were placed in these cages, but humans were also placed inside the wicker man. Then the human giant effigy was set on fire. Just imagine who hollered it the loudest. Was it the wailing of the animals, or was it the wailing of the humans that were set on fire and burned in this highly flammable wicker structure? All was offered up as a sacrifice on the night of Samhain. The grain and fruit sacrifice and the human sacrifices. All was offered up to the Celtic god. And so, many folk in the Christian church today, especially the black Christian churches, have no inkling of knowledge how absolutely evil, wicked, and abominable this holiday is. And because of the lack of knowledge regarding Halloween, we as a people bring curses upon ourselves and are plagued with demonic attacks of all sorts. Now remember, believers cannot be directly cursed, but believers can unwittingly give permission for a curse to work upon them. One of the ways this could happen is allowing Satan to do what he wills through the Halloween rituals. We wonder why we suffer from curses that we are not aware of. We only know that things are not going right in our lives. It is because we are serving two gods. We are mixing the holy with the profane, and we are operating from a place of ignorance and no knowledge of what is holy unto the Lord and what is abomination. We are putting our hands on Satan's stuff. We are polluting ourselves with the very abominations God has told us not to touch. We are involving ourselves in satanic rituals, thinking that we are doing it for the enjoyment of our children. But what does the Bible tell us about these wicked days? Exodus, the 22nd chapter, verse 18. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Leviticus, the 7th chapter, verse 26. Moreover, ye shall eat no manner of blood, whether it be of fowl or of beast, in any of your dwellings. Deuteronomy, the 18th chapter, verse 10 to 12. There shall not be found among you any one that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord, and because of these abominations the Lord thy God doeth drive them out from before thee. Leviticus the 19th chapter, verse 31. Regard not them that have familiar spirits, neither seek after wizards to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. We do not celebrate Halloween because we are interested in doing good and not evil. Ephesians the 5th chapter, verse 11. have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. And so, if your birth certificate lists you as Negro, if you have taken a DNA test from one of the DNA companies, 23andMe, Family DNA, or one of the other DNA companies, and your continent of origin is placed in Africa, you are Hebrew, not African. Know your identity, Israel. But most of all, know who you are in Christ. Touch not the abominable thing, and leave the abominable thing to the pagans. Shalom.